A flood, a phenomenon that can be both fascinating and frightening, since it can cause severe damage to both life and property. Anyone who has experienced a flood can testify to the suffering, sadness, and disruption of life it causes. Flooding is not simply a water problem. It is a people problem as well. A lot of what we do and don't do affects the frequency and impact of a flood. In this video, we will look at how best we can manage the risk of flooding here in the Caribbean. According to the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Response Agency, a flood is the most frequent type of environmental disaster. The agency also reported that despite the fact that flooding was the most frequent hazard in the region, many of the countries affected had no plans in place to deal with the disaster. When the rate of rainfall exceeds the rate of infiltration to the ground, the excess water, called runoff, moves across the ground surface towards the lowest section of the watershed. As the surface water enters stream channels, stream levels increase. If the rate of runoff is high enough, water in the streams overflow the banks and flooding occurs. The area of the overbank flow is called the floodplain.
In terms of the Caribbean, in these small islands, in the volcanic islands, the concept of flooding can be entirely different from, say, flooding in a flat area like Guyana or Belize. In these islands where you have steep hills and so on, the flooding mainly of a flashy type. You have heavy rainfall, you have water coming down through these steep rivers with a very high velocity. You will have the rain falling, the flood will last an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and then everything is back, or seems to be back to normal, except for the trees and litters and so on around. Whereas in flat areas, you can have flood existing there, the water being stagnant on the land for weeks.
Now, flooding is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it is important to the environment. For example, flooding helps distribute nutrients onto floodplains. However, extreme levels of rainfall can generate so much water that it spills over the natural capacity of the watercourses and extends into the floodplain areas, causing disruption to the normal activities of our societies. The problem is not so much that floodwaters are encroaching on our living areas, but rather we have gone out to meet the floodwaters, since many of our activities are taking place in the floodplains. According to some researchers, flooding is caused by three main factors: rainfall patterns, the nature of the land over which the water flows, and the characteristics of drainage systems in place to deal with flooding. The first factor, heavy or intense rainfall, can result in rivers and other waterways overflowing their banks. High levels of rainfall also cause erosion of the soil, resulting in clogging of waterways. Many countries of the Caribbean are prone to violent thunderstorms and hurricanes. As we all know, hurricanes usually bring heavy rains. Over the past 15 years, there has been severe flooding in the Caribbean as a result of hurricanes and thunderstorms, causing much devastation and even loss of life. Another factor in the cause of flooding is the nature of the land over which the water flows. Like the sponge, the soil is able to absorb and hold water that falls onto it. If for some reason an impervious layer develops on the surface of the soil, it will lose its ability to absorb water. Much of the water falling on the land will then simply run off, resulting in flooding.
We have replaced a lot of the lands that were originally forested with impervious areas, roads and roofs and and concrete surfaces, which significantly reduce the infiltration. And forest, in fact, enhances infiltration, and increased infiltration means we have a significant reduction in runoff. So without that, we have increased peak flows. We also have velocities that are much faster. And increased peak flows mean that the rivers cannot accommodate the new discharges. as well as the increased velocities may cause erosion to the riverbanks if they're exposed.
In Trinidad, along the east-west corridor, where hills have been cleared for housing and other urban developments, flooding now occurs almost every time there are heavy rains. And in St. Vincent, the flooding in the Mesopotamia Valley has been a result of the clearing of land to accommodate the banana plantations there. Despite heavy rainfall and increased water runoff from the soil, whether or not flooding occurs really depends on the drainage system set up to handle excess water runoff from the land. Drainage systems are indeed a third factor in the cause of flooding. Here in the Caribbean, flooding usually occurs because the drainage systems are either not designed to handle extreme rainfall, like what you get during hurricanes and storms, or the drains are blocked or clogged. Wood and debris are usually the objects causing the blockage.
This bridge has caused the major flooding we had in 2002. It was the major source perhaps. Flow from the river comes down and meets a relatively reduced waterway. The bridge in fact is narrower than the actual width of the river, and on that particular flood there was lots of bamboo also further blocking the bridge, which already has a reduced waterway area, and of course the usual sequence of events: blockage, backup and spillage.
So now that we know some of the major causes of flooding and the damage that can result, what can be done to better manage or even prevent flooding? Well, since a flood is a water-related disaster, any approach to managing the risk of floods should be part of a wider integrated water resources management process. Essentially, integrated water resources management is the process of managing and developing a country's water, land and related resources in a way that balances social and economic needs and ensures that the environment is protected. This means combining the development of land and water resources so as to maximize the benefits of the floodplains while reducing the loss of life and property from flooding. This plan involves 5 main elements. The first element is managing the water cycle as a whole. This involves linking drought management strategies for those for flood management by effectively making use of the benefits of floodwaters. The second element, integrating land and water management, seeks to combine land use planning and water management into one synthesized plan that involves the 3 areas of concern in managing the river basin. These areas are water quality, water quantity, and the processes of erosion and deposition. Next, flood management should involve a mix of strategies that complement each other. This would be the third element, adopting a best mix of strategies. The fourth key element in this integrated process is ensuring a participatory approach to flood management. This means that users, planners, policymakers and stakeholders at all levels of society should be involved in flood risk management. Finally, the fifth element is adopting integrated hazard management approaches. Flood management should be part of all disaster and hazard emergency planning and should involve experts from all areas of society. One specific strategy that can be part of an integrated flood management approach is watershed management. First of all, a watershed is the surrounding land from which water drains into a stream or lake, or the area from which a stream or river begins.
Watershed management is actually an umbrella term that covers the planning and management of all activities undertaken in the watershed, including the floodplain.
Watershed management, then, is the process of setting up and implementing plans that efficiently use the resources found in the watershed.
We talk about land use, we talk about soil, we talk about the environment, we talk about all the natural resources and everything that is in the watershed, the ecosystem, the whole ecosystem, everything that, so plants, animals, soils, land.
By ensuring that these resources are used in a manner that does not negatively affect the soil or water base, watershed management can help Caribbean countries better deal with the impact of flooding. Watershed management makes use of structural or engineering practices as well as non-structural practices.
The non-structural measures would include measures such as the use of land use zoning plans. Land use zoning plans identify areas that are most suited for settlement. So we use what is called, for example, a flood hazard map, which will identify key locations where settlement would be best suited and hazard-prone areas that may be unsuited for development. Reforestation would be a classic example of where we would try to replace vegetation and in particular forested areas that would have been stripped of their vegetation. So replanting would be a very good approach to mitigating the flood. We also use what is called the building code. The building code is designed to tell you what type of building you can design to minimize the risk of flooding. In the building code, we can also indicate what type of building materials can be used to protect the building from the risk of flooding.
By adopting and enforcing building codes, Caribbean governments can help ensure that buildings such as houses, schools, hospitals and shopping malls, as well as roads and bridges, are properly constructed to withstand flooding. Other measures such as early warning and providing communities with information on flooding should also be used. Many of the strategies discussed so far are relatively low cost and do not require high levels of technology. However, these alone may not be enough to reduce the impact of flooding. That's why the engineering and building of certain structures is also needed.
The structural measures we are talking about, and I think many people know about them, are the walling and paving of drains, the dredging, any river works really, the bridges and culverts expansion to ensure that they are as large as the drains and rivers that they are within. Detention basins or retention basins, pumps.
Regular cleaning and maintenance of existing structures such as drains and water channels also go a long way towards reducing the impact of floods. Taking steps to guard against the ravages of flooding is not just the responsibility of government. There is a lot that the general public can do.
We need to become sensitized to the importance of the forest, the importance of vegetation, the importance of providing control for sediments. When we construct our houses, for example, we have to start looking at ways of ensuring during the wet season that we do not have runoff of sediments from our construction sites.
For centuries, people have tried to reduce the damage and casualties caused by flooding. The impact may even increase in the future because of climate change and population growth. To help minimize the havoc wreaked by floods, Caribbean countries need to carefully review their current flood risk management strategies.